The frostbite had turned all 8 of the newborn foal's legs completely black, the tissue dead from hoof to knee. The giant mare refused to leave Thomas's cabin until he found a way to make her babies walk again. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The winter wind howled across the Montana plains like a wounded beast, carrying with it sheets of snow so thick that the world beyond Thomas Brennan's cabin disappeared entirely. For 3 days, the blizzard had raged without mercy, transforming the landscape into an endless white void where sky and earth became indistinguishable. Thomas stood at his frosted window, his calloused hand pressed against the cold glass, watching the storm with the wary respect of a man who had lived through 47 winters in this unforgiving land. His cabin was small but sturdy, built by his grandfather's hands nearly a century ago from timber cut from the surrounding forest. The walls were thick, the roof pitched steep to shed snow, and the stone fireplace in the center radiated a warmth that barely reached the corners of the single room. Thomas had prepared well for the storm, as he always did. His shelves were stocked with canned goods and dried meat. His woodpile was high, and his animals were secured in the barn 100 yards from the house, or at least they were supposed to be. The sound came just after midnight on the 3rd night, a thunderous pounding that shook the cabin door in its frame. Thomas jolted awake from his chair by the fire, his heart hammering in his chest. In all his years living alone on this remote plot of land, nothing had ever disturbed him in the dead of a blizzard. Bears were hibernating, wolves sought shelter, and no human in their right mind would venture out in such conditions. Yet the pounding continued, desperate and insistent, as though something was trying to break through the heavy wooden door. Thomas grabbed his rifle from above the mantel, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He approached the door cautiously, listening to the rhythm of the impacts. It wasn't the random battering of wind-driven debris. This was purposeful, almost frantic. Through the howling wind, he heard something else, a sound that made him lower his rifle in disbelief. It was the unmistakable whinny of a horse, high-pitched and terrified. He threw back the bolt and pulled the door open, and the wind nearly ripped it from his hands. Snow blasted into the cabin, stinging his face and momentarily blinding him. But there, filling the doorway like some mythical creature from a winter legend, stood the largest mare Thomas had ever seen. She was a magnificent draft horse, easily 17 hands high, with a coat that might have been pale gray or white beneath the layer of ice and snow that clung to her massive frame. Her eyes, wild and desperate, locked onto his, and in that moment, Thomas understood. She wasn't just seeking shelter, she was begging for help. The mare pushed forward without waiting for an invitation, her enormous body forcing Thomas to step back as she entered the cabin. Her hooves clattered on the wooden floor, leaving pools of melting snow in her wake. She was shivering violently, her breath coming in great steaming clouds that filled the small space with moisture. Thomas could see ice crystals forming in her long mane and forelock, and her legs were caked with frozen mud and snow up to her knees. But what caught his attention most were the marks on her flanks, deep scratches and what looked like bite marks that had frozen over with blood. Thomas quickly shut the door against the storm, his mind racing. This horse didn't belong to him. His own 2 geldings were in the barn, or at least he hoped they still were. This mare was a stranger, and yet she had somehow found her way through a blizzard that would have killed most creatures within minutes of exposure. She must have come from one of the neighboring ranches, though the closest was more than 5 miles away. What could have driven her out into such deadly conditions? The mare moved deeper into the cabin, her massive body taking up most of the available space. She positioned herself near the fireplace, and Thomas noticed something that made his blood run cold. The mare kept looking back at the door, her ears swiveling forward and back, and she released a low, rumbling nicker that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. She was calling to something. Someone. Thomas's stomach tightened with realization. This mare hadn't come alone. She had left something behind in the storm, something she desperately needed to protect. Without hesitation, Thomas grabbed his heaviest coat from the hook by the door and wrapped a scarf around his face. He pulled on his insulated gloves and boots, knowing that even a few minutes in the blizzard could mean frostbite or worse. The mare watched him with those intelligent eyes, and when he opened the door again, she tried to follow him out. Thomas pushed against her massive chest, speaking firmly but gently, telling her to stay where it was warm. She resisted at first, but when Thomas stepped out into the storm and began following the deep tracks she had left in the snow, the mare seemed to understand. She remained in the doorway, backlit by the fire's glow, her silhouette enormous and protective. The cold hit Thomas like a physical blow, stealing his breath and making his eyes water instantly. The tears froze on his cheeks as he bent into the wind, following the mare's tracks that were already filling with fresh snow. He could barely see more than a few feet ahead, but the tracks were still visible, deep impressions that spoke of the mare's desperate journey. Thomas had no idea what he would find at the end of this trail, but the mare's behavior told him everything he needed to know. Whatever she had left behind was worth dying for. And in this storm, death was only minutes away for any creature left exposed to the elements. Thomas trudged through snow that reached his thighs, each step a battle against the wind that seemed determined to push him back toward the cabin. His flashlight beam barely penetrated the swirling white chaos, creating more shadows than illumination. The mare's tracks led away from his property, veering toward the old abandoned barn that sat on the edge of what used to be the Morrison place. The Morrisons had left 3 years ago after old Gerald died, and the property had fallen into disrepair. Thomas rarely ventured that direction anymore. The barn was nearly a quarter-mile from his cabin, and in this weather, it might as well have been on another planet. His lungs burned with each breath of frigid air, and his fingers were already going numb despite the thick gloves. Thomas knew he was pushing the limits of safety, that he should turn back, but something drove him forward. The mare's desperate eyes haunted him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that lives hung in the balance. He pressed on, using the fence line as a guide when the tracks became too obscured by fresh snow. The wind shrieked around him like a living thing, and more than once he stumbled over hidden obstacles buried beneath the white blanket. When the dark shape of the Morrison barn finally emerged from the blizzard, Thomas felt a surge of relief mixed with dread. The structure was listing to one side, its roof partially collapsed under the weight of accumulated snow. One of the large doors hung askew on broken hinges, creating a gap just wide enough for a desperate horse to squeeze through. Thomas approached cautiously, his flashlight sweeping across the entrance. The tracks led directly inside, and he could see where the mare had struggled to push through the narrow opening. Thomas squeezed through the gap, grateful to be out of the wind even though the barn's interior was barely warmer than the outside. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a scene that made his heart clench. There, huddled in the corner of an old stall, were 2 tiny foals. They couldn't have been more than a few days old, their legs still wobbly and uncertain. They were pressed together for warmth, their small bodies shivering uncontrollably. One was slightly larger than the other, with a coat that might have been chestnut under the layer of grime and ice. The smaller one was pale like its mother, barely visible in the dim light, except for the dark, frightened eyes that reflected Thomas's flashlight. Thomas approached slowly, speaking in a low, soothing voice. The foals tried to stand, their spindly legs struggling to support their weight. The larger one managed to get to its feet, positioning itself protectively in front of its smaller sibling. Thomas could see their breath coming in rapid, shallow puffs, and he knew they didn't have much time. Hypothermia was already setting in. Their ears were flat against their heads, not from aggression but from cold, and their small bodies were covered in a thin layer of frost. He quickly assessed the situation. There was no way he could carry both foals at once, not through waist-deep snow in a blizzard. They each probably weighed close to 100 pounds, and they were too weak to walk on their own. Thomas's mind raced through possibilities, each one more desperate than the last. He could try to make multiple trips, but that would mean leaving one alone while he transported the other. In this cold, even 20 minutes of separation could mean death. He needed help, but his nearest neighbor was miles away, and his phone had no signal out here even on good days. Then Thomas remembered the old wooden sled that Gerald Morrison used to haul feed. He swept his flashlight around the barn and spotted it hanging on the far wall, covered in dust and cobwebs, but still intact. It was meant for hauling hay bales, but it might work for the foals. Thomas pulled it down, testing its integrity. The wood was solid, and the rope handle was frayed but still functional. It wasn't ideal, but it was his only option. He approached the foals again, moving slowly and deliberately. The larger one stepped back, trying to shield its sibling, but Thomas could see the resignation in its eyes. These babies were exhausted, beyond fear, operating on pure survival instinct. Thomas stripped off his heavy coat, immediately feeling the bite of cold through his layers of wool and flannel. He wrapped the coat around the smaller foal, who was shaking so violently that Thomas could hear its teeth chattering. The tiny creature didn't resist as Thomas lifted it onto the sled, its legs too weak to support any struggle. The larger foal watched with wide eyes as Thomas secured its sibling with rope, making sure the coat stayed wrapped tightly. Then he turned his attention to the second foal. He had nothing left to wrap it in except his own flannel shirt, which he pulled off without hesitation. The cold hit his bare skin like 1,000 needles, but Thomas gritted his teeth and wrapped the shirt around the chestnut foal's shivering body. He positioned it on the sled next to its sibling, the two tiny horses pressed together for warmth. Thomas pulled his undershirt and sweater back on, knowing it wouldn't be enough protection for the journey ahead. His hands were shaking now, whether from cold or adrenaline he couldn't tell. He grabbed the sled rope and gave it an experimental tug. The weight was manageable, but pulling it through deep snow while fighting the wind would be another matter entirely. Thomas looked down at the two fragile lives he was now responsible for, their eyes reflecting his flashlight like small beacons of hope in the darkness. He thought of the Mare waiting at his cabin, pacing and calling for her babies. He thought of his own mother who had died when he was young, and how she would have fought through hell itself to protect him. Thomas wrapped the rope around his waist and leaned into the harness he'd created, beginning the slow, agonizing journey back toward his cabin. Every step was torture, his muscles screaming in protest as he dragged the sled through drifts that sometimes reached his chest. The wind pushed against him with such force that he had to angle his body like a ship tacking into a storm. Several times he fell, his knees sinking into the snow, and each time he had to summon strength he didn't know he possessed to rise again. The journey back felt like it lasted hours, though Thomas knew it could only have been 30 minutes at most. Any longer than that, and they all would have died out there in the white void. His body had gone beyond pain into a strange numbness that he recognized as the early stages of hypothermia. His thoughts were starting to drift, becoming fuzzy around the edges, and he knew that was dangerous. He forced himself to count his steps, to focus on the mechanical act of putting one foot in front of the other. 1, 2, 3, 4. Pull, breathe. Repeat. It became a mantra that kept him tethered to consciousness. When the warm glow of his cabin finally appeared through the storm, Thomas felt tears freeze on his cheeks. He didn't remember starting to cry. The Mare was still visible in the doorway, her massive form silhouetted against the firelight, and when she saw Thomas emerging from the blizzard with the sled, she let out a piercing whinny that cut through the wind. It was a sound of pure joy and relief, a mother's cry upon seeing her children again. The sound gave Thomas the final burst of energy he needed to close the remaining distance. The mare backed into the cabin to make room, her hooves clattering anxiously on the wooden floor. Thomas dragged the sled right up to the door and then, with the last of his strength, lifted first one foal and then the other across the threshold. The moment they were inside, the mare was on them, nickering softly and running her nose over every inch of their small bodies. She licked their faces, their ears, checking them with an urgency that spoke of the terror she must have felt leaving them behind. Thomas collapsed against the door frame, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. His entire body was shaking and he couldn't feel his fingers or toes. He knew he needed to get warm, needed to change out of his wet clothes, but he couldn't seem to make his limbs obey. He just sat there, watching the reunion between mother and children, transfixed by the raw emotion playing out before him. The mare positioned herself protectively over the foals, her large body creating a shelter as she continued her anxious inspection. It was only then, as the adrenaline began to fade and his mind started to clear, that Thomas noticed something odd. The foals weren't nursing. They should have been desperate for milk after being separated from their mother in such cold conditions. But they lay there shivering, making no attempt to stand or feed. The mare seemed to notice it too. She nudged them gently, encouraging them to rise, but neither foal responded beyond a weak shifting of position. Thomas forced himself to move. He stripped off his wet clothes with fumbling fingers, leaving them in a sodden heap by the door. He pulled on dry thermal underwear and his warmest wool pants and sweater, then wrapped himself in a thick blanket. Only then did he approach the small family huddled near his fireplace. He added more wood to the fire, building it up until waves of heat radiated through the cabin. Steam began rising from the mare's damp coat, and slowly the ice in her mane started to melt, dripping onto the floor. Thomas knelt beside the foals, studying them more carefully now that they were in the light. What he saw made his stomach drop. Both foals had their legs extended in an unnatural way, and when he gently touched the smaller one's front leg, it felt wrong, too rigid, too cold. He carefully unwrapped his coat from around the tiny body, and what he discovered made him suck in a sharp breath. The foal's legs below the knees were dark, almost black, and the skin felt hard to the touch. Frostbite. Severe frostbite. With growing dread, Thomas examined the second foal and found the same condition. Both babies had extensive cold damage to their lower legs. The tissue was already dying, the cells destroyed by ice crystals that had formed during their ordeal in the barn. Thomas had seen frostbite before in livestock caught out in bad weather, and he knew what it meant. At best, these foals would lose parts of their hooves. At worst, they would lose their legs entirely, and for a horse that was a death sentence. The mare seemed to sense something was wrong. She lowered her head, pressing her nose against each foal in turn, as if trying to will life and warmth back into their damaged limbs. Her eyes, when she looked at Thomas, held a question that broke his heart. She had fought through a deadly blizzard to bring him back to her babies. She had trusted him to save them. And now he had to figure out how to break the news that he might not be able to. Thomas ran a hand through his wet hair, his mind racing. It was past 2 in the morning, the storm was still raging, and he had no way to contact a veterinarian. Even if he could reach Dr. Sarah Chen in town, she couldn't possibly make it out here until the storm broke. That might be tomorrow. It might be 3 days from now. By then, it might be too late. He needed to do something now, but what? He wasn't a vet. He was just a farmer who knew enough about animals to keep his own stock alive. Thomas stood and went to his kitchen, pulling out the first aid kit he kept under the sink. It was designed for humans, not horses, but the basic principles were the same. He needed to rewarm the tissue gradually, assess the damage, and prevent infection. He filled his largest pot with lukewarm water, not hot, because rapid rewarming could cause more damage. He tested the temperature with his elbow the way his mother used to test bath water when he was a child. It felt barely warm, which was exactly right. He carried the pot back to the foals and sat down beside them. The mare watched him intently, her ears forward, her body tense. Thomas spoke to her in a low, calm voice, explaining what he was doing, even though he knew she couldn't understand the words. Sometimes the tone was enough. He carefully lifted the smaller foal's front leg and lowered it into the water. The foal flinched and tried to pull away, but it was too weak to put up much resistance. Thomas held the leg steady, supporting the tiny hoof in the warm water. The mare shifted nervously, but she didn't interfere. It was as if she understood that Thomas was trying to help. He repeated the process with each of the foal's 4 legs, changing the water when it cooled, keeping each limb submerged for at least 20 minutes, as he'd learned from an old rancher years ago. The smaller foal trembled throughout the ordeal, its eyes glazed with exhaustion and pain. When Thomas moved to the larger foal, the chestnut one, he found it even less responsive. This one barely reacted when its legs were placed in the water, and that worried Thomas more than anything. After an hour of careful warming, Thomas gently dried each leg and examined them again. The tissue hadn't improved. If anything, the true extent of the damage was now more visible. The skin below the knees on all 4 legs of both foals had turned a mottled purple-black, and when Thomas pressed gently on the areas, there was no blood flow returning. The capillaries were destroyed. He sat back on his heels, feeling defeat settle over him like a heavy cloak. The mare was watching him, her intelligent eyes seeming to read the despair in his face. She nickered softly, a sound that seemed to ask him not to give up. Thomas looked at the 2 fragile foals lying before him, at their mother who had risked everything to save them, and he made a decision. He didn't know if he could help them. He didn't know if they would survive the night. But he knew he had to try. He owed them that much. He owed the mare that much for her incredible courage and determination. Thomas spent the rest of that endless night in a battle against time and nature. He fashioned makeshift bandages from clean towels, wrapping each tiny leg carefully to protect the damaged tissue from further injury. He knew the wrappings wouldn't heal the frostbite, but they might prevent infection from setting in while the dead tissue remained attached. The foals tolerated his ministrations with the patience of creatures too exhausted to protest, their eyes half closed as they drifted in and out of consciousness. The mare never left their side. She stood over her babies like a sentinel, occasionally lowering her massive head to nuzzle them with a tenderness that seemed impossible for such a large animal. When Thomas needed to move around them to tend to their care, she would shift her position but never moved more than a few feet away. At one point, around 4 in the morning, Thomas tried to encourage her to drink some water. He filled a bucket and held it out to her, but she barely took a few sips before returning her attention to the foals. As dawn began to break, pale gray light filtering through the cabin windows, Thomas realized the storm was finally weakening. The wind had died down to intermittent gusts, and the snow had changed from a blinding horizontal assault to a gentle vertical fall. He looked out the window and saw that the world had been transformed into an alien landscape of white drifts and sculptured snow formations. The path to his barn was completely buried, and he couldn't even see the structure through the accumulation. His thoughts turned to his own horses. Duke and Chester had been in the barn when the storm hit, with plenty of hay and water. They were hardy animals, accustomed to Montana winters, but 3 days was a long time to be without checking on them. Thomas knew he needed to dig his way to the barn soon, but he couldn't leave the foals. Not yet. Not when their condition remained so precarious, and the mare was counting on him. The smaller foal, the pale one like its mother, seemed to be declining rapidly. Its breathing had become shallow and irregular, and its body temperature, despite all of Thomas's efforts, remained dangerously low. Thomas gently stroked the tiny horse's neck, feeling how cold it still was despite the roaring fire and the blankets he'd piled around it. The foal's heartbeat was rapid and thready under his palm, working overtime to maintain circulation through a body struggling to survive. The larger chestnut foal appeared slightly stronger, though that assessment was relative at best. It had managed to lift its head a few times and had even made weak attempts to stand before collapsing back onto the blankets. Each time it tried to put weight on its damaged legs, it would let out a pitiful whimper that tore at Thomas's heart. The mare would immediately respond to those sounds, lowering her head to nuzzle and encourage her baby with soft, nickering sounds. Thomas made another pot of coffee, his fourth of the night, and stood at the window watching the storm's final throes. The sun was trying to break through the clouds, creating an ethereal glow across the snow-covered landscape. It would have been beautiful if circumstances were different. As he sipped the bitter coffee, his mind kept returning to the severity of the frostbite damage. He'd seen enough injured animals in his years of farming to know that what he was looking at was catastrophic. The tissue death extended well above the hooves on all four legs of both foals. By 8 in the morning, the storm had stopped completely. Thomas used his satellite phone, a concession to safety that he kept charged for emergencies, and managed to get through to Dr. Sarah Chen's office. Her receptionist informed him that the doctor was already out on emergency calls, dealing with livestock issues all over the county. The storm had wreaked havoc on farms and ranches for 50 miles in every direction. Thomas explained his situation in detail, describing the frostbite, the foal's weakened state, and the mare's refusal to leave them. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then the receptionist put him on hold. When she returned, her voice carried a new urgency. Dr. Chen wants you to keep them as warm as possible and try to get some electrolyte solution into them if you can. She's going to finish her current call and head straight to you. She says she should be there within 3 hours, maybe less if the roads are passable. 3 hours felt like an eternity, but it was better than Thomas had hoped. He thanked her and hung up, then set about following the doctor's instructions. He had electrolyte powder that he used for his own horses during hot summer months. He mixed it with warm water and attempted to get the foals to drink using a turkey baster, squirting small amounts into their mouths. The chestnut foal swallowed reflexively, though most of the liquid dribbled down its chin. The smaller foal was less responsive, and Thomas had to be extremely careful not to choke it. The mare watched these proceedings with intense focus, her ears swiveling forward every time Thomas touched her babies. She seemed to understand that he was trying to help, but her body remained tense, ready to intervene if she perceived any threat. Thomas talked to her constantly, maintaining a low, soothing monologue that seemed to calm her as much as it helped him organize his thoughts. Around 10 o'clock, Thomas heard the distant sound of an engine. He looked out the window and saw a truck with a plow attachment working its way up the road toward his property. Behind it came a white veterinary truck with Dr. Sarah Chen's name emblazoned on the side. Thomas felt a wave of relief so powerful it nearly buckled his knees. Help had arrived. Real help. From someone who actually knew what they were doing. Dr. Chen was a woman in her early 40s, compact and efficient in her movements. She'd been the large animal vet for this region for 15 years, and Thomas had called on her services many times for his own stock. She entered the cabin carrying 2 large medical bags, her expression shifting from professional concern to visible shock when she saw the scene before her. The giant draft mare standing guard over 2 impossibly small foals in the middle of a bachelor farmer's living room was not what she'd expected. "My God," Sarah breathed, setting down her bags and approaching slowly. "Thomas, tell me everything. Start from the beginning." As Thomas recounted the night's events, Sarah knelt beside the foals and began her examination. She worked with practiced efficiency, checking vital signs, examining the frostbite damage, her face growing more grave with each discovery. The mare watched her with wary eyes but didn't interfere, perhaps sensing that this human possessed knowledge that could help. When Sarah finally sat back on her heels, her expression was grim. She looked up at Thomas, then at the mare, then back at the foals. "Thomas," she said quietly, "I need to show you something." She carefully unwrapped the bandages from the smaller foal's front leg, revealing the full extent of the damage in the bright morning light. The tissue below the knee was completely black now, with a distinct line of demarcation where healthy pink tissue met dead black flesh. "This is fourth-degree frostbite," Sarah explained, her voice heavy with professional sadness. "The tissue is completely necrotic. All 4 legs on both foals show the same damage. Thomas, these babies have lost everything below their knees. The hooves, the tendons, the bones, all of it is dead tissue." Her voice cracked slightly as she continued, "I've never seen frostbite this severe in foals this young. The fact that they're still alive is remarkable, but Thomas, you need to understand what this means." Thomas felt his stomach drop as Sarah's words sank in. He'd known the frostbite was bad, had seen the blackened tissue and understood it meant death of the affected areas, but hearing a professional confirm the extent of the damage made it real, in a way his own observations hadn't. He looked at the mare, who was watching Sarah with those intelligent eyes, clearly sensing the gravity of the situation, even if she couldn't understand the words. "What are their chances?" Thomas asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her hands still resting gently on the pale foal's damaged leg. "In a normal situation, with adult horses, we might consider amputation and prosthetics. There have been cases where horses have lived relatively normal lives with artificial limbs. But these are newborn foals, Thomas. They're maybe 3 or 4 days old at most. Their bones are still developing, their bodies are fragile, and they've already been through severe trauma." Sarah looked up at him, and Thomas could see tears gathering in her eyes despite her professional composure. The standard recommendation in cases like this would be humane euthanasia. The kindest thing we can do is prevent their suffering. They can't walk, can't stand, can't nurse properly. The infection risk alone is astronomical, and the pain they'll experience as the dead tissue begins to separate from the living, it's not something any creature should have to endure, especially not babies. Thomas felt like he'd been punched in the gut. He looked at the 2 tiny forms lying on his cabin floor, wrapped in blankets and bandages, their eyes half closed in exhaustion. They'd fought so hard to survive. The mare had fought so hard to save them, and now he was being told that the merciful thing was to end their lives before they'd barely begun. His throat tightened, and he had to swallow several times before he could speak. "Is there any other option? Any chance at all?" His voice came out rough, barely more than a whisper. Sarah slowly rewrapped the foal's leg, buying herself time to formulate her answer. There was something in her expression that Thomas couldn't quite read, a conflict between her medical training and something else, something more personal. "There's a veterinary research facility in Colorado," Sarah said finally, "about 8 hours from here by highway, longer with the current road conditions. They specialize in innovative treatments for livestock, including experimental prosthetics for young animals. Dr. James Morrison runs the program. He's done some remarkable work with injured foals, things that most vets would say are impossible." She paused, clearly weighing her words carefully. "But Thomas, I have to be honest with you. The survival rate for cases this severe is less than 10%. The journey alone could kill them. And even if they make it, even if Dr. Morrison agrees to take them on, the treatment would be expensive. We're talking tens of thousands of dollars, maybe more." Thomas didn't have tens of thousands of dollars. His farm barely broke even most years, and he'd been living off savings and the occasional odd job to make ends meet. The smart thing, the practical thing, would be to let Sarah do what needed to be done. It would be quick, painless, and it would end the suffering that was inevitable if the foals continued to cling to life. But as Thomas looked at the mare, At her massive form standing protectively over her babies, he thought about her journey through the blizzard. She'd walked through deadly conditions to find help. She'd brought him to her babies when she could have simply stayed with them, keeping them warm with her body until they all froze together. She chose to fight, Thomas said quietly. She didn't give up even when giving up would have been easier. How can I give up when she didn't? Sarah nodded slowly, as if she'd been expecting this response. She stood and walked over to her medical bag, pulling out her satellite phone. Let me call Dr. Morrison. I can't promise anything, but I can at least ask if he'd be willing to see them. While Sarah made the call, Thomas sat beside the foals and the mare. He placed one hand on each small body, feeling their hearts beating rapidly beneath his palm. They were so fragile, so impossibly delicate, and yet they were still here, still breathing, still fighting. The mare lowered her head until her nose was almost touching Thomas's face. Her warm breath washed over him, carrying the sweet scent of hay and horse. For a long moment, they stayed like that, human and horse, locked in a silent communication that transcended language. Thomas felt certain in that moment that the mare understood what was at stake, that she knew he was trying to help, and that she was asking him, begging him, not to let her babies die without a fight. Sarah's voice drew him back to the present. She was speaking rapidly into the phone, using medical terminology that Thomas couldn't follow. He caught phrases like severe bilateral frostbite and neonatal trauma and experimental prosthetics. Finally, Sarah lowered the phone and looked at Thomas with an expression that was equal parts hope and apprehension. He'll see them, she said. Dr. Morrison says if we can get them to Colorado alive, he'll evaluate them and determine if they're candidates for his program. He made no promises, Thomas. He was very clear about that. But he's willing to try. The transport alone is going to be incredibly risky. We'll need to stabilize them as much as possible, set up IV fluids, keep them warm but not too warm, monitor their vital signs constantly. And we need to leave soon. Every hour we wait increases the risk of infection and complications. Thomas nodded, his mind already racing ahead to logistics. I'll need to call my neighbor Jake to take care of Duke and Chester. We'll need to figure out how to transport the mare, too. She won't let her babies go without her. Sarah smiled faintly at that. I was counting on it. Actually, having her along might help. Foals do better when their mothers are present. It reduces stress, which is critical in their condition. My truck has a modified livestock trailer. It's designed for transporting injured animals. We can make space for all three of them. Over the next hour, Thomas and Sarah worked with focused intensity to prepare for the journey. Sarah started IV lines on both foals, threading the tiny catheters into their veins with practiced precision and securing them carefully. She administered antibiotics, pain medication, and fluids, explaining each step to Thomas as she worked. The foals tolerated the procedures with barely a whimper, too weak to put up much resistance. Thomas called his neighbor Jake, a retired rancher who lived about 3 miles down the road. Despite the early hour and the aftermath of the storm, Jake agreed without hesitation to come over and take care of the property while Thomas was gone. That's what neighbors are for, Jake said gruffly over the phone. You just focus on those babies and that mare. Don't worry about nothing else. The hardest part was getting the mare into the trailer. She was deeply reluctant to leave the cabin, to move away from her foals even for a moment. Thomas and Sarah had to load the foals first, placing them carefully on a bed of clean straw in the trailer's modified compartment before the mare would even consider following. Even then, she balked at the trailer ramp, her eyes showing white around the edges as she danced nervously at the entrance. Thomas stood at the top of the ramp speaking to her in that same low, calm voice he'd used throughout the long night. Come on, girl. Your babies need you to be brave one more time. They need you to trust us. For several long minutes it seemed like the mare might refuse, might choose to stay rooted to the spot, rather than enter the unfamiliar trailer. But then one of the foals let out a weak cry, a sound of distress that cut through the morning air like a knife. The mare's ears snapped forward, and without further hesitation she walked up the ramp and into the trailer, positioning herself as close to her babies as the space would allow. The journey to Colorado began under a bright winter sun that seemed almost mocking given the gravity of their mission. Sarah drove with careful precision, avoiding potholes and taking turns slowly to minimize jostling. Thomas rode in the back of the trailer with the mare and foals, monitoring the IV lines and checking vital signs every 15 minutes as Sarah had instructed him. He'd brought a notebook and was keeping meticulous records of heart rates, respiratory rates, and body temperatures, knowing that Dr. Morrison would need this information. The mare stood like a statue for the first hour, her legs braced wide to maintain balance as the trailer swayed gently with the movement of the truck. Her head remained lowered toward her foals, and occasionally she would make soft nickering sounds that seemed to comfort them. Thomas found himself talking to her constantly, narrating what he was doing, describing the scenery they were passing, anything to fill the tense silence with human voice. He'd read somewhere that horses responded to the tone of voice more than the words themselves, and he hoped his steady monologue was providing some reassurance. Around noon, they stopped at a rest area so Sarah could check on her patients. She climbed into the trailer, her medical bag in hand, and performed a thorough examination of both foals. Her expression remained professionally neutral, but Thomas could see the concern in her eyes. The smaller foal, the pale one, had developed a slight fever. Not dangerously high yet, but enough to worry about. Sarah adjusted the antibiotic dosage and made notes in her own medical file. "We're about 4 hours out," she told Thomas. "They're holding on better than I expected, honestly. That mare is part of the reason. Stressed animals decline faster, and her presence is keeping them calmer than they would be otherwise." She glanced at the massive draft horse who was watching her every movement with intense focus. "She's remarkable, Thomas. I've worked with horses for 20 years, and I've never seen maternal instinct this strong. Most mares would have abandoned foals this injured. Survival of the fittest is nature's way, but not her." Thomas looked at the mare with renewed respect. "You came through a blizzard for them. You found help when most animals would have just stayed and waited to die. What happened to you out there? What's your story?" The mare, of course, couldn't answer, but Thomas found himself wondering about her origins. Someone owned this horse. She was too well bred, too well muscled despite her ordeal to be wild or abandoned. Somewhere someone might be looking for her, or perhaps, like the foals, she'd been left to die when things got difficult. They resumed the journey, and Thomas settled back into his routine of monitoring and recording. The landscape outside the trailer's small windows changed from snowy plains to rolling foothills, and eventually to the dramatic peaks of the Rocky Mountains. The altitude increased, and Thomas noticed both foals breathing harder as the air thinned. He mentioned this to Sarah at their next stop, and she administered oxygen through small nasal tubes, another piece of equipment from her surprisingly comprehensive mobile veterinary unit. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the snow-covered mountains in shades of pink and gold, they finally saw the sign for the Morrison Veterinary Research Facility. It was larger than Thomas had expected, a sprawling complex of modern buildings set against a backdrop of pine forest. Sarah pulled the trailer up to a large barn-like structure where a team of people in blue scrubs was already waiting. Dr. Morrison must have called ahead because they moved with the efficiency of a well-rehearsed emergency response team. Dr. James Morrison himself emerged from the building as Sarah opened the trailer. He was a tall man in his 60s with silver hair and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. He took one look at the mare and foals and let out a low whistle. Sarah described this over the phone, but seeing it is something else entirely. Let's get them inside and stabilize before we discuss treatment options. Thomas, you're the owner? Thomas shook his head, suddenly aware of how ridiculous his claim to these animals was. No, sir. I'm just the man who found them. Or rather, the mare found me. It's her story, not mine. Doctor. Morrison smiled at that, a quick flash of warmth before his professional demeanor returned. Well, let's make sure this story has a happy ending if we can. His team moved with practiced coordination, transferring the foals to specialized gurneys equipped with heating elements and monitoring equipment. The mare followed anxiously, nickering and trying to stay close to her babies. Thomas had to admire how the team worked around her rather than trying to separate her, understanding that her presence was crucial to the foal's psychological state. Inside the facility, Thomas was struck by how much it resembled a human hospital. The floors were spotless white tile, the walls painted in soothing pale blue, and the equipment looked state-of-the-art. They wheeled the foals into what Dr. Morrison called the intensive care unit, a room filled with specialized equipment Thomas couldn't begin to identify. The mare was allowed to stand just outside the treatment area where she could see and smell her babies, but wouldn't interfere with the medical procedures. Dr. Morrison and his team worked for nearly an hour, performing examinations, taking blood samples, and capturing X-rays and ultrasound images of the damaged legs. Thomas and Sarah stood outside with the mare, watching through a large window. The mare pressed her nose against the glass, her breath creating small circles of fog that dissipated and reformed with each exhalation. Thomas rested his hand on her shoulder, feeling the tension in her massive body, the trembling that spoke of exhaustion and fear. Finally, Dr. Morrison emerged from the ICU and gestured for them to follow him to a nearby conference room. The mare tried to follow too, but one of the assistants stayed with her, speaking softly and offering her hay and water, which she ignored completely. In the conference room, Dr. Morrison pulled up images on a large monitor, and Thomas felt his stomach clench at what he saw. The X-rays showed the extent of the damage in stark black and white. The bone structures in all 4 legs of both foals were compromised below the knees, exactly as Sarah had described. "I'm not going to sugarcoat this," Dr. Morrison began, his voice grave but not without compassion. "What we're looking at is catastrophic damage. In my entire career, I've only seen 3 cases this severe in foals, and none of those animals survived. The tissue death is complete, and the structural integrity of the limbs is gone. However," he continued, and Thomas felt a small spark of hope ignite in his chest, "I believe these foals might be candidates for a new prosthetic system we've been developing. It's experimental, and I need to be very clear about that. We've only tested it on 2 foals before, both older and stronger than these 2. One survived and is thriving. The other didn't make it through the surgery." Thomas swallowed hard. "What are their actual chances, in your professional opinion?" Dr. Morrison was quiet for a moment, studying the images on the screen. "If we do nothing, they'll die within a week, maybe 2 if we manage infection well. The pain will be considerable as the dead tissue separates from the living. If we attempt the prosthetics, their chances improve to maybe 25%, possibly 30 if everything goes perfectly. The surgery itself is high risk. They're so young, so fragile, but if they survive the procedures and the recovery period, they could potentially live relatively normal lives." Sarah leaned forward in her chair, her professional interest clearly piqued despite the grim circumstances. "Can you explain the procedure, Dr. Morrison? What exactly would it involve?" Dr. Morrison stood and walked to a cabinet, pulling out what looked like a detailed model of a horse's leg. He set it on the table and began pointing to various components as he spoke. "The traditional approach to amputation in horses involves removing the damaged portion and fitting a prosthetic to the remaining stump. But with foals this young, we don't have enough bone structure to work with using conventional methods. What we've developed is a system that essentially integrates with the remaining bone, as the foal grows. He pulled out several photographs showing horses, some of them quite young, standing and even running on artificial limbs that looked remarkably natural. The prosthetics are made from a titanium alloy core with a specialized polymer coating that's porous enough to allow bone integration. We call it osseointegration, where the living bone actually grows into the prosthetic over time, creating a permanent bond. The exterior is fitted with a cushioned hoof-like structure that provides traction and shock absorption. Dr. Morrison looked at Thomas directly, his expression serious. But before we can even get to the prosthetics, we have to perform the amputations, all 4 legs on both foals. That's 8 separate surgical procedures that will need to be done in 2 sessions to avoid overwhelming their systems. Thomas felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. 8 amputations on newborn horses. The very idea seemed barbaric, even if the goal was to save their lives. "What about pain management? Recovery time?" he asked, trying to understand what these tiny creatures would have to endure. Dr. Morrison nodded approvingly at the question, as if Thomas had just passed some kind of test. "We have excellent pain management protocols. The foals will be kept comfortable throughout the entire process. Recovery is where things get complicated. They'll need to remain immobile for the first 2 weeks, while the surgical sites begin to heal. That means slings to support their body weight, constant monitoring, and intensive care around the clock. Then comes the challenging part, teaching them to use the prosthetics. Foals have an instinct to stand and walk within hours of birth. These foals will have to relearn everything they instinctively know about being a horse." Thomas thought about the cost, about the impossibility of what was being proposed, and about the mare standing in the hallway, pressing her nose against the window. "How much are we talking about?" "For everything?" Dr. Morrison exchanged a glance with Sarah before answering. "For both foals, including surgery, prosthetics, and the initial recovery period, we're looking at somewhere between $60,000 and $80,000. If complications arise, it could go higher." "Thomas, I understand that's a substantial amount. If you need time to consider this, or if you need to explore other options, I completely understand." Thomas laughed, a short, bitter sound that held no humor. "I'm a farmer barely making ends meet. I don't have $60,000. I don't have $6,000 saved up. Those horses don't even belong to me. I don't know where they came from or who owns them. By all logic, I should say thank you for your time, put them down, and go home." He paused, rubbing his face with both hands. "But I can't. That mare fought through a blizzard to save her babies. She found me, trusted me to help. How can I be the one to tell her it's over?" The room fell silent. Sarah reached across the table and placed her hand over Thomas's. "Thomas, no one would judge you for making the practical choice. You've already done more than most people would. You saved these foals from freezing to death. You brought them here. That's something." Dr. Morrison cleared his throat softly. "There might be another option. My facility operates partly on grants and donations. We have a fund for cases like this, situations where the medical need is significant but the financial resources aren't available. It's not unlimited, and I can't cover everything, but I might be able to reduce the costs significantly." Thomas looked up, hope flickering despite his attempts to remain realistic. "How significantly?" Dr. Morrison pulled out a calculator and began running numbers. "If we classify this as a research case, which it legitimately is given the severity and the foal's age, I can apply for grant funding to cover about 60% of the costs. My facility would absorb another 20% as part of our educational and research mission. That would leave you responsible for roughly $16,000. Still a substantial sum, but more manageable than the full amount. $16,000 might as well have been $1 million to Thomas. He owned his property outright, having inherited it from his father, But there was no equity to borrow against given its remote location and modest condition. He had maybe $8,000 in savings, money he'd been carefully setting aside for emergencies and inevitable farm repairs. He looked at Sarah, then at Dr. Morrison, then down at his weathered hands that told the story of a lifetime of hard work. Before Thomas could respond, there was a commotion in the hallway. The mare had apparently had enough of being separated from her foals. They could hear her hooves striking the floor, her distressed whinnying echoing through the facility. One of the assistants appeared at the door, looking apologetic. "Dr. Morrison, the mare is becoming agitated. We've tried everything to calm her, but she's not responding. I think she needs to see her foals, or she's going to hurt herself trying to get to them." Dr. Morrison sighed but nodded. "Bring her in. Let's do this conversation with all parties present. It seems appropriate somehow." A few minutes later, the mare was led into the conference room, her enormous body taking up most of the available space. She immediately went to Thomas, pushing her nose against his chest, then turned to look at Dr. Morrison with those intelligent eyes that seemed to understand far more than should be possible for a horse. Thomas stood and moved to the mare's side, placing his hand on her neck. He could feel her heart beating rapidly beneath his palm, could sense the anxiety rolling off her in waves. She knew her babies were close but couldn't reach them, couldn't protect them, couldn't fulfill the most basic duty of a mother to keep her offspring safe. Thomas made his decision in that moment. Consequences be damned. "Do it," he said firmly. "Do the surgeries. I'll figure out the money somehow. I'll take out loans, sell equipment, whatever it takes. These foals deserve a chance, and this mare deserves to see her babies have that chance." Dr. Morrison studied Thomas for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I'll start the paperwork and schedule the first surgery for tomorrow morning. We'll do the smaller foal first since she's in slightly worse condition. The second foal will be the following day." He extended his hand to Thomas. "I want you to understand something. Even with everything we can do, there are no guarantees. These foals might not survive the surgery. They might not survive the recovery. But I promise you that we will do everything in our power to give them the best possible chance." Thomas shook his hand, feeling the weight of the commitment he'd just made settling onto his shoulders. "Thank you, Dr. Morrison. Thank you for being willing to try." Sarah stood as well, gathering her things. "I need to head back tonight. I have other patients who need me. But Thomas, I'll check in regularly. You call me if you need anything, understand? Anything at all." Thomas nodded, grateful for her kindness and expertise. She'd gone above and beyond her duty as a veterinarian, and he knew he'd never be able to properly repay that debt. After Sarah left, Dr. Morrison's team got to work preparing for the next day's surgery. They moved the foals to a preoperative area where they could be monitored overnight. The mare was given a stall adjacent to the ICU with a window that allowed her to see her babies. She wasn't happy about the arrangement, but she seemed to understand that this was as close as she was going to get for now. Thomas spent that night in a small room the facility provided for families of animal patients. It was sparse but clean, with a narrow bed, a chair, and a window overlooking the paddocks, where several horses grazed peacefully in the moonlight. He couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the foals lying helpless on his cabin floor, or the mare's desperate eyes as she pounded on his door, or the blackened tissue that meant death and amputation. He kept running the numbers in his head, trying to figure out how he was going to come up with $16,000. Around 3 in the morning, Thomas gave up on sleep and walked down to the stables. The facility was quiet, except for the soft sounds of horses shifting in their stalls and the occasional nicker. He found the mare standing alert at her window, watching the ICU, even though she couldn't see much in the darkness. When she heard Thomas's footsteps, she turned her head and released a low, rumbling greeting that somehow conveyed both welcome and worry. Thomas entered her stall, and she immediately moved closer to him, pressing her massive head against his chest. He wrapped his arms around her neck as far as they would reach, feeling the solid warmth of her, the strength that had carried her through the blizzard and brought her babies to safety. "I don't even know your name," he whispered into her mane. "I don't know where you came from or who you belong to, but I promise you, girl, I'm going to do everything I can for your babies." The mare stood still, accepting his embrace and his words, and for a moment Thomas felt a connection so profound it almost took his breath away. This wasn't his horse, these weren't his foals, he had no legal claim to them, no practical reason to be bankrupting himself for their care. But in that moment, standing in a stable hundreds of miles from home in the middle of the night, Thomas understood that sometimes life presents you with choices that transcend logic and practicality. Sometimes you're called to do something simply because it's right, because walking away would diminish something essential in your own soul. The surgery began at 8 the next morning. Dr. Morrison and his team had been preparing since dawn, sterilizing instruments, checking equipment, reviewing procedures. Thomas was allowed to be present for the preoperative preparation, watching as they carefully anesthetized the smaller foal and positioned her on the surgical table. The tiny pale body looked impossibly fragile under the bright lights, her chest rising and falling with the assisted breathing. The mare had been given a mild sedative to help her cope with the separation, but even through the medication, her distress was evident. She paced in her stall, calling out periodically, and Thomas stayed with her, speaking in that same calm voice that seemed to soothe them both. "It's going to be okay. Dr. Morrison is the best. He's going to help your baby. Just a little while longer and you'll have her back." The surgery took 6 hours. 6 hours during which Thomas alternated between sitting with the mare and pacing the hallways, drinking terrible coffee from the break room and staring at his phone as if willing it to ring with good news. Finally, Dr. Morrison emerged from the surgical suite, still in his scrubs, pulling off his surgical cap. His face was drawn with exhaustion, but there was a glimmer of cautious optimism in his eyes. "She made it through," Dr. Morrison said, and Thomas felt his knees go weak with relief. All 4 amputations were successful. The bone cuts were clean, and we were able to preserve more length than I initially thought we could. That's going to be important for the prosthetic fitting. She's in recovery now, still under anesthesia, but her vital signs are stable. Thomas found he couldn't speak, could only nod as emotion threatened to overwhelm him. Dr. Morrison placed a hand on his shoulder. "Don't celebrate yet. The next 48 hours are critical. Infection, shock, complications from anesthesia. There are still a dozen things that could go wrong. But she's alive, and that's more than I expected at this stage." Thomas was allowed to see the foal in recovery, and what he saw was both heartbreaking and hopeful. The tiny pale body lay on a specialized cushioned surface, her legs wrapped in pristine white bandages that ended in rounded stumps where her hooves should have been. 4 lines snaked from her neck, delivering fluids and medications, and monitoring equipment tracked every heartbeat and breath. She looked so small, so vulnerable, like a broken toy that someone was desperately trying to repair. The next day brought the second surgery, and Thomas went through the same agonizing wait. The chestnut foal, slightly larger and stronger, had better odds according to Dr. Morrison, but Thomas knew better than to count on anything at this point. He'd learned that hope and certainty were dangerous companions, that celebration before victory was a form of hubris that the universe loved to punish. So he waited, and he worried, and he sat with the mare, who seemed to be aging before his eyes, with the stress of separation from her babies. This surgery took even longer, nearly 7 hours. Complications with bleeding, Dr. Morrison would later explain. The chestnut foal had a blood clotting issue they hadn't anticipated, making the procedure more delicate and dangerous. But again, the team's skill and determination prevailed. When Dr. Morrison emerged this time, He looked like he'd aged a decade, but he was smiling. 2 for 2, he said simply. Now comes the hard part. Thomas almost laughed at that. The hard part? They'd just amputated 8 legs from 2 newborn horses, and that wasn't the hard part. But Dr. Morrison was serious. Surgery is controlled. We know what we're doing in there. Recovery is where things get unpredictable. Infection, rejection of the prosthetics, failure to adapt, depression, loss of will to live. I've seen animals give up after trauma like this. They just decide they're done fighting, and there's nothing we can do to stop it. The foals were moved to the ICU together, placed in adjacent slings that supported their weight while their surgical sites healed. The slings were ingenious devices made of padded canvas that cradled their bodies, leaving their legs free to hang and heal without bearing weight. The mare was finally allowed into the ICU to be with them, and the reunion was profound. She moved from one baby to the other, nickering softly, running her nose over every inch of them she could reach, checking them with an urgency that spoke of the terror she'd endured during their separation. Thomas watched this reunion with tears streaming down his face. He wasn't ashamed of the tears, wasn't embarrassed by the depth of emotion these animals had evoked in him. There was something sacred about what he was witnessing, something that reminded him why life mattered, why struggle mattered, why fighting for the vulnerable and voiceless was perhaps the most human thing a person could do. Over the next week, Thomas barely left the facility. He slept in the family room when exhaustion forced him to, but most of his time was spent in the ICU with the mare and foals. He learned to check the surgical sites for signs of infection, to adjust the slings when the foals shifted positions, to recognize the subtle signs that indicated pain or distress. The staff treated him as part of the team, teaching him what he needed to know and trusting him to help with basic care. The healing process was slower than anyone wanted, but faster than Dr. Morrison had dared hope. Both foals showed remarkable resilience, their young bodies responding to treatment with the kind of determination that seemed to run in their bloodline. The surgical sites began to heal cleanly, the swelling reduced, and the risk of immediate post-operative complications diminished with each passing day. By the end of the second week, Dr. Morrison declared them ready for the next phase, the fitting of their prosthetic limbs. The prosthetics themselves were marvels of veterinary engineering. Each one had been custom designed based on measurements taken during the surgeries, crafted to fit the unique dimensions of each foal's remaining bone structure. They were surprisingly lightweight, made from that titanium alloy Dr. Morrison had described, with a porous surface that would eventually allow the bone to grow into and bond with the artificial limb. The exterior was covered in a cushioned polymer that mimicked the shock absorption properties of a natural hoof. Thomas watched as the team fitted the first prosthetic to the smaller foal's front right leg. The tiny pale horse, whom Thomas had started calling Hope in his mind, tolerated the procedure with remarkable patience. She'd been through so much already that this new intrusion barely registered. The prosthetic was attached with a combination of surgical pins that integrated with the bone and an external brace that would be adjusted as she grew. It was a delicate balance, providing enough stability to bear weight, while allowing for the natural development of a growing foal. The fitting process took 3 days to complete all 4 legs on both foals. Each prosthetic had to be precisely calibrated, the weight distribution carefully calculated to ensure the foals wouldn't damage their developing bodies by favoring certain legs over others. The chestnut foal, whom Thomas thought of as Courage, proved to be more sensitive to the fittings. He would flinch and whimper when the team made adjustments, and the mare would become agitated at these sounds, requiring Thomas's constant reassurance. Then came the moment of truth. 2 weeks and 3 days after the surgeries, Dr. Morrison decided it was time to let the foals try to stand. The slings would remain in place as a safety measure, but they would be loosened enough to allow the foals to put weight on their new legs if they chose to attempt it. Thomas's heart hammered in his chest as he watched the team make the adjustments. Everything they'd done, All the money spent, all the hope invested, came down to this moment. Could these foals actually learn to stand and walk on artificial legs? Hope was first. As the sling loosened around her body, she shifted nervously, feeling the change in support. Her eyes were wide, reflecting the bright lights of the ICU, and she looked to her mother, who nickered encouragement. For several long minutes, nothing happened. The foal simply hung in the sling, her new prosthetic legs dangling uselessly beneath her. Thomas felt despair beginning to creep in. Maybe this was too much to ask. Maybe the instinct to stand was so tied to the sensation of natural hooves that artificial ones would never trigger the same response. But then, almost imperceptibly, Hope shifted her weight. One of her front prosthetics touched the padded floor of the ICU, then the other. She was testing them, feeling out this new reality of her body. The mare moved closer, her nose almost touching Hope's face, and she released a soft, encouraging nicker that seemed to say, "You can do this. I know you can." The foal's hind legs came down next, all 4 prosthetics now bearing a portion of her weight, though the sling still held most of it. And then, with a determination that brought tears to every person in that room, Hope tried to stand. Her legs shook with the effort, the prosthetics wobbling uncertainly beneath her tiny body. She fell back into the sling once, twice, 3 times, but on the 4th attempt she locked her artificial knees, straightened her back, and stood. She was standing. A foal with no natural legs below the knees, standing on 4 artificial limbs that shouldn't have worked but somehow did. The room erupted in applause and tears, and even Dr. Morrison had to wipe his eyes. Hope stood for perhaps 30 seconds before her strength gave out and she sank back into the sling's support. But those 30 seconds were enough. They proved the concept, validated the months of research and development that had gone into creating these prosthetics. More importantly, they showed that Hope had the will to adapt, to overcome, to be a horse despite everything nature and circumstance had taken from her. Courage's turn came the next day, and his journey to standing was different but equally powerful. He was larger and slightly stronger than his sister, but he was also more cautious, more hesitant to trust these strange new appendages that had been attached to his body. He tested each leg individually, putting weight down and pulling back, down and back, as if conducting his own private assessment of their reliability. The mare stood beside him throughout this process, and Thomas noticed something remarkable. She would occasionally use her body to support him, leaning against him when he wobbled, providing a stable point of contact that gave him confidence. When Courage finally stood, he did so with less drama than his sister, but with equal determination. He locked his prosthetics in place and held the position for nearly a minute before needing to rest. Dr. Morrison was ecstatic. In all his years of veterinary medicine, he'd never seen foals adapt to prosthetics so quickly or so completely. Usually it took weeks of physical therapy, of coaxing and encouraging before amputee animals would even attempt to use artificial limbs. But Hope and Courage were already standing within days of receiving them. The next phase was teaching them to walk. This proved to be the greatest challenge yet. Walking required coordination, balance, and a complete rewiring of instincts that told them how their legs should move and feel. The team used a combination of physical therapy techniques and the mare's natural ability to encourage her foals. They would place treats just out of reach, motivating the foals to take steps. They would use the slings to support most of the weight, while allowing the foals to practice the motion of walking without the full burden of their body weight. Progress was measured in inches. A single step forward was cause for celebration. 2 steps in succession felt like a miracle. Thomas documented every moment, taking photos and videos that he knew he would treasure forever. He also started a crowdfunding campaign online, sharing the foal's story with the world in hopes of raising money to cover the mounting medical expenses. The response was overwhelming. Within a week, donations poured in from across the country and around the world. People were captivated by the story of the Mare who fought through a blizzard, the farmer who risked everything to help, and the foals who refused to give up. By the end of the 4th week, both Hope and Courage could walk short distances with minimal support from the slings. Their gait was uneven and awkward, nothing like the graceful movement of normal horses, but they were walking. They were moving under their own power, exploring their environment, interacting with each other and their mother in ways that had seemed impossible just a month earlier. The mare's joy was palpable. She would prance alongside her babies as they practiced walking, nickering encouragement and occasionally grooming them with her teeth in a gesture of pure maternal love. 6 weeks after that desperate night in the blizzard, Thomas received a phone call that changed everything. A rancher named Michael Hartley from Wyoming had seen the crowdfunding campaign and recognized the mare. She'd been stolen from his property 3 months earlier, along with 2 other pregnant draft horses. He'd been devastated by the loss, had filed police reports and searched extensively, but had eventually given up hope of ever seeing her again. Her name was Grace, and she'd been one of his most prized breeding mares. Michael drove to Colorado the next day, bringing with him registration papers, photographs, and a lifetime of stories about Grace. Thomas watched through the window as the rancher approached the paddock, where Grace now spent her days with Hope and Courage. The moment Grace saw Michael, her entire body language changed. She released a piercing whinny and trotted to the fence, her massive head reaching over to nuzzle the man who had clearly loved her deeply. Michael was crying openly, his hands shaking as he touched her face and whispered words Thomas couldn't hear but could feel the weight of. They sat in Dr. Morrison's office later that day, the 3 men navigating the complicated emotions and logistics of the situation. Michael was overwhelmed with gratitude for everything Thomas had done, insistent on repaying every penny of the medical expenses. But Thomas found himself reluctant to accept the money, not because he didn't need it. He desperately did, but because taking payment somehow felt like it would diminish what had happened, turn it into a transaction rather than what it truly was, an act of love and determination. "I want to buy them," Thomas heard himself say, surprising even himself with the words, "Grace and the foals. Whatever they're worth, I'll find a way to pay you." Michael looked at him with understanding in his eyes, the recognition of one person who loved horses seeing that same love reflected in another. "Thomas, those foals wouldn't exist without you. Grace wouldn't have survived that blizzard trying to save them if you hadn't opened your door. As far as I'm concerned, they're already yours. Consider it payment for saving her life." But Thomas shook his head. "That's not right. You bred Grace, you raised her, you loved her first. I can't just take what's yours." The 2 men looked at each other across the desk, both understanding the weight of what was being discussed. These weren't just animals. They were living beings with whom deep bonds had been formed, connections that transcended ownership papers and monetary value. Finally, Dr. Morrison cleared his throat. "Gentlemen, might I suggest a compromise? Michael, you keep legal ownership of Grace. She's your mare and she should go home with you. Thomas, you adopt the foals. They'll need specialized care for the rest of their lives, regular adjustments to their prosthetics as they grow, ongoing medical monitoring. The crowdfunding campaign has raised enough to cover the remaining balance and then some. Use that money to build facilities on your property that can accommodate their needs. This way, everyone gets what they truly want, the horses get the best possible care, and 2 men who clearly love these animals can both remain part of their lives." The solution felt right to everyone. Michael would take Grace home to Wyoming, where she would live out her days in the comfort and safety she deserved. But Thomas would visit regularly, and Michael would bring Grace to see her foals several times a year. Hope and Courage would stay with Thomas, who would transform his modest farm into a place where they could thrive despite their disabilities. The crowdfunding campaign had raised over $40,000, enough to cover all remaining medical expenses and fund the construction of specialized stables with level floors and wide doorways. 3 months after that blizzard night, Thomas loaded Hope and Courage into a custom trailer for the journey back to Montana. They were stronger now, able to walk with increasing confidence, though they would never move with the effortless grace of normal horses. Dr. Morrison had taught Thomas everything he needed to know about maintaining the prosthetics, about recognizing signs of complications, about helping the foals continue their physical therapy. The goodbye at the facility was emotional, with staff members who had invested so much time and care into the foals coming to wish them well. Grace made the journey too, riding in the front compartment of the trailer, unwilling to be separated from her babies even for the drive home. Michael followed in his own truck, planning to stay a few days to help Thomas get everything set up before taking Grace back to Wyoming. The sight of the small convoy pulling up to Thomas's cabin brought neighbors out from miles around, all curious to see the famous foals they'd read about online. Jake, Thomas's neighbor who had cared for Duke and Chester during the long weeks away, had rallied the community to help. While Thomas was in Colorado, they'd built a beautiful new barn with level concrete floors, wide stalls with padded walls, and a small indoor arena where the foals could exercise safely regardless of weather. There were ramps instead of steps, specialized feeders at the perfect height, and even radiant floor heating for cold Montana winters. As Thomas led Hope and Courage into their new home for the first time, with Grace following protectively behind, he felt a sense of completeness he hadn't experienced since before his divorce. His cabin would never be quiet again, ever. The foals would require constant attention, regular veterinary care, and a level of commitment that would tie him to this place more firmly than ever. He would probably never take a vacation, never have the freedom that came with a simpler life. And yet, watching Hope take her first tentative steps across the padded floor of her new stall, seeing Courage explore his space with growing confidence, and observing Grace settle contentedly into the knowledge that her babies were finally truly safe, Thomas couldn't imagine wanting anything else. The local news ran a feature on the foals a week later, and the reporter asked Thomas if he regretted the sacrifices he'd made, the money spent, the time invested in saving animals that weren't even originally his. Thomas thought about that question for a long moment before answering. When I opened my door that night and saw Grace standing there, desperate and determined to save her babies, I had a choice. I could have turned away, told myself it wasn't my problem, protected myself from the cost and complication. But I've learned something through all of this. The things worth having in life are the things we're willing to fight for, even when the odds are impossible and the cost is high. He looked at Hope and Courage, playing together in their paddock under Grace's watchful eye, their prosthetic legs carrying them across ground they should never have walked on. "What that vet found on those foals' legs," Thomas said quietly, addressing the title question that had drawn so much attention to their story, was heartbreak and hope in equal measure. The heartbreak of seeing such young, innocent creatures suffering from injuries that should have killed them, but also the hope that comes from watching them refuse to give up, from seeing love and determination triumph over cruel circumstances. Those prosthetics represent both the tragedy of what they lost and the miracle of what they gained. As the sun set over the Montana plains that evening, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and pink, Thomas stood at his fence watching his extended family. Grace would return to Wyoming soon, but she would visit, and her foals would grow and thrive in this place that had become theirs through the most unlikely of circumstances. The blizzard that could have ended everything had instead become the beginning of something beautiful. Hope and Courage would never be normal horses, but they would be loved horses, cherished horses, horses whose very existence was a testament to the power of compassion and the unbreakable bonds that can form between species when we open our hearts to the possibility of connection.